Good morning and happy Friday, dear friend. Glad you are here with us on the Key Radio Morning Show. Your hosts, Grant Burkhalter and Heather Zander, that's me. And in the studio with us this morning is Pastor Chris Dotson of Lone Peak Bible Church in Highland, Utah.
Good morning.
So glad you're here.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Did the wind kind of blow you in, or is it still kind of
No, it was
calm right now?
calm,
Yeah,
yeah.
I'm just waiting for it. Just waiting for it. It's like batten down your small children and your chickens and whatever else, because it's just going to be blowing all over the place.
Yeah, my kids will like that. They'll be playing in the yard,
It's like, where'd your hat go? Don't know.
Yeah.
Don't know. It was a lot of fun.
They'll try and pull out kites or whatever else. Yep.
Yeah. Oh, it's crazy weather. But yeah, and we got to be praying for our friends in the Northeast with the nor'easter. Is that what they call those things? Where the Arctic
Sure.
comes down and it meets some other Atlantic thing, and then it's just like stuff everywhere. That's crazy. And then I was just reading like, oh, and by the way, June starts hurricane season, which I thought was like maybe an August thing, but it says it goes from June to September. And I'm like, well, that's pretty much all of summer. Yay. I mean, might as well just keep it winter. That's crazy.
We're in the preseason right now.
We're in the preseason of the hurricanes. What's going on at Lone Peak? Do tell.
Well, we've just been, keeping on going through. We've been doing a study in the book of Mark and regular things. Yeah, small groups during the week and, meeting on Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Just family life.
Yeah, it's been great.
That's good. Well, that's good. And friend, we're going to continue to talk about this, but if you're interested in Lone Peak Bible Church, I suggest you just go to lonepeak.church, and then you can find out more about this amazing, sweet church family and just to get to know them a little bit. I do want to share with you, there's a few other things that are going on in the next couple of weeks. And first off, if you are in the Uinta Basin and you're interested in giving your children some Christian education, open enrollment starts this coming Monday, April 8th at the Uinta Basin Christian Academy in Vernal. So if you want more information or just ask questions or what have you, they're really open to talk to you about that. So that could be an option. Then also there is the UTeach, or Utah Christian Homeschool Association, annual convention, the 29th annual convention, which is amazing, and that's coming up on the 12th and the 13th. So next week, Friday? Is that Friday? I don't even know. What is that? Yeah, Friday and Saturday. We're going to have a number of speakers, and for more information, you can definitely go to, you can contact us, or you can go to utch.org. And I think right now you can just register at site on the 12th when you get there. But check out their website for more information on that. And then also for ministry leaders, especially those in small church ministries, you might want to consider checking out the Small Church Enrichment Conference that's coming up on April 29th, not 29th, 27th, and that is located at the First Baptist Church in Nephi, Utah. It's just going to be a time of fellowship and just encouragement and some breakout sessions and stuff like that. So you can contact us or go to barnabasenrichmentministries.org. And that's all the stuff that I have right in front of me. So any other announcements, Chris, maybe?
Nope.
No? Okay. Well, should we get started? I'm kind of excited about this.
Yeah, it's going to be good.
Okay. All right. So you said that you were going through the book of Mark. I went ahead and went on your website, and I think that's always a good place to start. Go on the website and say, what are you learning about? And I'm like, oh, you're in the book of Mark, and you're in Mark chapter 2.
Right.
And I'm like, let's just talk about this. Let's talk about what you've been talking about as a church family.
Yeah.
But before we begin, I just got to ask a question. It's like, how do you determine what to talk about and what to teach as a pastor of a local church? Because churches are very autonomous, and it's like, well, we're going to teach the Bible, but there's just a lot of material here. So what led you to teach in the book of Mark?
Yeah. So personally, I enjoy going through a book. You get the context, and once you establish the history, etc., all of it kind of just gets laid out for you. So for me personally, I enjoy making my way through a particular book, and right now it's Mark. And why Mark? Well, as a pastor, I kind of spend a little time praying, and then I ask myself the question, what is it that my people need to hear? And sometimes that will kind of be something that makes me lean one way or another. And then just kind of take into account where we've been, where our studies have been, and we haven't been in a gospel in several years, and so it was good for us to come back to Jesus and to understand his life and ministry and how that impacts us.
And I think it's important that we differentiate what you mean by gospel, because there's the gospel and there's the gospels. So can you explain to us what that difference is?
Yeah.
Because I'm assuming that you every week you're preaching the gospel.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm talking about Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John
Okay,
as
the
the
Gospels.
four gospels, as they give us details about the life of Christ. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That's good.
and the thing about the Gospels is that they cover a lot of the same stuff, because it's talking about the earthly ministry of Jesus. So it's like the time from some of the Gospels go over his birth, and I think it's two of them have that account, right? Mm-hmm. It's Matthew and Luke. Yeah, and then they cover that 3-year period of like from when he was 30 to 33, and that's his ministry with all the miracles and the sermons that he gave, and then the death, burial, and resurrection. But the thing is, each of these Gospels are written by different authors, and they kind of focus on different things.
Right.
So what's unique about the Gospel of Mark?
Mark is the snapshot. It's really quick. One of his favorite words is immediately. And so he's just kind of walking you through everything very quickly. It's the shortest of the gospel accounts. However, he's very detailed. And the way that he writes, he gives us some of the details that even some of the other gospel writers don't give us. But it's cool that you get these different perspectives, because then you can kind of overlay them with each other, and you get a more fuller picture of what has happened. And so some people like to say, well, this is, using these, they find contradictions between these books. But anytime you have multiple witnesses to an event, you're going to have multiple perspectives. And so we can put all those pieces together and get a fuller picture of the life of Christ.
Yeah, what stood out to me, we went through the book of Mark on the morning show. I think it was like last year, and what stood out to me was the authority of Christ that's highlighted in the Gospel of Mark.
Yeah.
Where Mark really shows the authority that Jesus has in these miracles that he's performing.
Right.
Where it's like he has authority over the wind and the waves, the weather. He had authority over sickness and authority over death. And so this is the authority that can only come from God. And here in this passage, we're going to see, even that is something that's underlying throughout this gospel, is that Jesus has the authority of God.
Yeah, you see that even in the first chapter, whenever the proclamations are made, and the way that he speaks, he steps into this position of having authority as king. And then, like you say, Mark he gives you evidence after evidence after evidence that Jesus is who he says he is as the Messiah.
And I think that's important when we are approaching any of the Gospels. And I'm back to your point about how some people say it's a contradiction. I love the Cold Case Christianity author, J. Werner Wallace, and he was a cold case detective. So but what he said is, people have different perspectives depending on, where they're coming from when they're approaching any sort of event, right? And he says if they were all identical, then there would be a problem. There would be some sort of light going on, like this something smells foul.
Yep.
But in this situation too, and we know this, like if I'm talking to somebody, let's say, who's really interested in books, and I tell them that I go to somebody's house, I'm going to probably gravitate and toward their bookshelf and say, and by the way, and talk about some of the books that they had on their bookshelves and stuff like that. But if I were in that same house and I was talking to somebody else who was, let's say, really interested in furniture, I would gravitate more toward the description of what the furniture looked like and so on and so forth. And again, to Grant's point, with Mark, he's talking more about the authority of Christ, and it's a go gospel, like you said. It's a snapshot. So Mark is going to be gravitating toward different events, and he's going to be seeing things in a little bit different way than Matthew and Luke and John. So so it's actually a complete, like you were saying, a complete picture versus contradictions. And I think that's really important that we understand that. And we know that when we're approaching other other genres of literature as well. We know that poetry is going to be poetry. We know that narrative is going to be narrative. We know that when we're reading about wars, that the author's not really caring about, the parks in the community, right? So it's kind of the same thing. And that's what I love about it. It's written in a way that makes sense, right?
It is.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's beautiful. So I'm really excited. We're in Mark. I really like Mark. I love the word, how he talks about immediately. And even when we're in chapter 2, the previous passages that you were teaching on, it's chapter 2, verse 8, immediately Jesus perceives. And then in verse 12, and he rose and immediately, so like we're seeing like a lot of go. And I think that really... I think that really appeals to like a Roman reader who's an action person anyway, right?
Yep.
So very cool. So you are in this section of chapter 2, verse 13. What's going on in this? Or maybe we need a grander context?
Yeah. So Jesus has begun his ministry. He's called a few disciples already. And so word is starting to trickle out about who he is and what he is able to do. And so already he's performed some miracles. There was a paralytic who was healed, and there was there was a paralytic who was healed. There was also a leper who has been healed, and just again, like there's these multiple layers of just revealing who Jesus is through this book. So this is just another evidence as we get into chapter 2, verse 13 of who Jesus is.
And I think, too, also his purpose for being on earth, too, which we're going to see at the end of this particular passage. So, I love purpose statements. I absolutely love purpose statements because I want to know, well, why? I mean, what's the whole point of this? And at the end of this, it's pretty cool to see how Jesus really articulates it. But let's dig in, shall we? So we are, friend, in Mark chapter 2. So if you are looking at the Bible, it would be the New Testament. And so in the Gospels, it always starts with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Those are the Gospels. So Matthew, we're in Mark right now. And it says, he went out again beside the sea, and all the crowd was coming to him, and he was teaching them. So already we have to kind of pause. Jesus is by. You got to picture the stuff in your mind, right? Because these are real occurrences. These things are really happening, and everything here is important. We have to understand that. So you can envision a crowd coming to Jesus. He's by the sea, and he is spending time teaching these people, okay? And as he passed by, he saw Levi, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth, and he said to him, "Follow me." And he rose and followed him. Okay, what's the significance here?
This is huge. This is incredible.
Okay.
So again, like you talked about this setting right there in Capernaum, this is a strategic tax center. There's a lot of things coming and going, a lot of business. And so there's tax collectors there, and tax collectors were seen as the worst of the worst. They were the most sinful of people. They were dishonest. They were often greedy. And they received their job by bidding against one another to see who could win this business of collecting taxes, okay? And so they would say, well, I can bring in this amount of money, and then everything above that amount then would be theirs. And so they would bid against each other, gain that franchise, so to speak, and then they would make money off of their brothers, fellow Jewish people. And so they were not liked at all. Right.
And I'm assuming then that perhaps the Romans didn't really have much regard for them as well, because they weren't really honorable in that sense, right?
Right. Yeah. So so the Jews saw them as being buddy with the Romans, right? Because they're taking their money and giving it to Rome. But then the soldiers, they would just have to step in and make sure that they were protected because they're collecting money. But I don't think that it wasn't a healthy relationship, right?
So are you seeing, like, friend? I mean, these are people that just were people. There was so much disdain for a tax collector here, and so the fact that Jesus passes by Levi and says, "Oh, follow me,"
right?
What
It's just shocking.
And I'm assuming because he's teaching a crowd. So it's not like he just walked up by himself and said, "Hey,
Right.
let's talk. Oh, let's go in the back room, and I'm going to ask you to follow me." This is very public and open.
Very much so. And this is why this is just so strange, so far beyond what was typical, right? Um, these people, just to help you get an idea of how the tax collector was viewed. A tax collector, they couldn't, they were just seen as such wicked people. Let's see, in order to be a tax collector, you basically had to give up everything. You had to give up your own heritage because your mom was going to be like, "Oh, I don't want to talk about that kid," right? It's not something she would bring up in her mom group, right? And so there's this hush hush about this kid that is now betraying his own people, and so he's turning his back on his own people. This person would have been hated, but they were after money, and that's what made it good is that they would go after money. And so, in the mindset of a tax collector is, how can I get this money? So that became their focus. If they didn't have any family, they didn't have any friends, at least they had money. And so that's what they're after. So there were two types of tax collectors. There were those who were kind of like the mob bosses, the guys who had people who were working under them and doing their thing. And then there were these other tax collectors that were in the tax booth that were directly working with the people. That's what we see here with Matthew, is he's directly working with the people. And sometimes the people even hated them more because it was the face-to-face. They knew exactly where their money was going, and it was this man in this booth that was taking it, right? And so there was this disdain for tax collectors.
Wow.
So when it comes to this individual, to Levi, why is he also referred to as Matthew? Because like in the Gospel of Matthew, it's the same guy that's being talked about, but in the Gospel of Matthew, it calls him Matthew, whereas Mark and Luke both call him Levi.
Yeah, that's a good question. We don't know. That's the simple answer. Some people speculate that after he come to know Jesus, maybe that was whenever he changed his name. It could be that because he was a tax collector, there was so much pressure and disdain for this man that he then changes his name. We don't exactly know, but we do know that Levi is the same man as Matthew. Yeah.
Okay. So here we are, sees Levi, Jesus does, the son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax booth. And then Jesus says to him the most startling thing. He says, "Follow me." And I think the other startling part of this is that Levi actually does.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so why do you think this is? I mean, we would all like to think that if Jesus calls us to do something, that we would obey, but that's just not the case. I mean, there's a lot of people who are following him, but why would a tax collector do this? Like,
I think that there tends to be details here that we don't have, and at the same time, there's also this expression, right? Already, right? Jesus has had to deal with this leper, right? And the leper was an outcast that was God used to use Jesus to show his power over those who are unclean, right? Jesus didn't become unclean because he touches a leper. And then there's this paralytic who Jesus uses to show his power to forgive sins. And now this outcast of a tax collector. And so it's just these layers, one on top of the other, proving who Jesus is. And so Jesus comes into this, and I think that there was probably, we recognize in verse 1, he went out again by the seashore. This was a regular occurrence. Jesus was doing ministry in Capernaum and moving about, going here and there. There could have been conversations. There could have been, Matthew could have heard Jesus teaching. And but what we do know is from those other instances, Jesus was able, from the paralytic, he was able to understand the paralytic's heart. Even without the paralytic confessing his own sin or seeing his need, Jesus was able to see what was going on in the heart of the Pharisees and in the heart of this paralytic. So I think what's going on here is Jesus isn't just blindly calling this man. I think that Jesus knows the man's heart. And so at somewhere along the way, there was something that happened, and we won't get into the whole chosen story and try and figure out, how dramatize the event. But something happened to make Matthew want to want to follow Jesus. And so there's no like concern or question, but I think what Jesus knows is he knows Matthew's heart. And so when he's able to call Matthew, Matthew's then able to respond so quickly.
Wow.
I think what we do know, what isn't quite so heavy in the speculation camp, is that being a tax collector would have been religious suicide, where it would be cutting yourself off completely from the temple,
Right.
from just the religious practices, from everything that made you a Jewish man was completely cut off from you. So something would have brought Matthew to this point where he would say, I'm rejecting all of this. I'm rejecting my heritage. I'm rejecting my family. I'm rejecting everything. And instead, I will take up this mantle as a tax collector. And so, having been at this point somewhere in his life, he now is sitting in his booth, and Jesus comes to him. Jesus is God, God incarnate, God in the flesh, comes to him and says, I want you. And many of us are in a similar situation where we feel like we have done something that completely severs us from God. And yet, here is Matthew in this same situation where God himself comes to him and says, I still want you. Despite anything and everything that you've done, I want you, follow me.
Doesn't this give us great comfort? I mean, let's just talk about this for just a second, because I think, Grant, you hit it right there. And you know, going forward, like back to kind of a couple of like a page prior. Here's Jesus, like you said. There's one's an unclean spirit. Okay, so spiritual depravity, right? Probably demonic stuff going on. Jesus overcomes that. Lepers. I mean, we talk about lepers like, oh, you're at, you know, we have euphemisms and phrases about lepers, like what do you treat me like a leper, that kind of thing. Well, unclean. They were people who were cast out of society because we don't want to get what they got, right? I mean, it was a very dire thing to be a leper. The paralytic. People like the questions that the disciples asked when they saw a paralytic, and they were like, hey, well, who sinned? Was it the man? Was it his parents? I mean, so there was a stigma to all of these things, that the difficulties of people, the physical ailments, there was some sort of stigma. And Jesus is just like, and he's overcoming all of those things and healing people and loving people and forgiving people. And so for us today, what is it that makes you that leper? What is it that makes you that paralytic? What is it that makes you that tax collector, that person that is not worthy to be clean? And quite frankly, it's all of us, okay? Don't delude yourself. Don't deceive yourself and say, oh, well, at least I'm better than so-and-so. The fact of the matter is we all have whatever it is. Jesus overcomes all of that. And the fact that, I don't know, in my brain, the fact that that Levi or Matthew is sitting in the tax booth, it means he's separated from his people. That means that he's basically caged. Even if there was no cage in front of him, he's still separated from everybody. He's an outcast. And Jesus comes to him. Jesus pursues him. And today, friend, I have to ask you, why are you listening to Key Radio? Particularly, why are you listening to this discussion? Maybe, let me just ask you the question, maybe this is God's way of pursuing you. Just the thought.
Yeah.
So the fact, though, that I'm seeing here, Jesus says, follow me, but there's still a human responsibility. What is Levi going to do at this moment? Is he going to say, yeah, I'm going to follow you? Or is he going to say, I don't know.
Yeah.
And Jesus pulls him out of the tax booth. Well, he responds, right? That's no different than what we have to do, right, Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is this is such a beautiful picture, right, of the way that we should respond to Jesus. This man Matthew, whenever he steps out of that tax booth, at that moment, he's saying, okay, I'm letting go of everything that I have grabbed onto. I'm letting go of money. Number one, that's what was the driving force behind being a tax collector. But number two, he's got no other people to turn to, right? And so he's basically saying, all right, I'm going after this. And as that they would have been working for Rome, that position, if he leaves, right, it's filled. He's losing his job, right, at this point in order to follow Jesus. And he makes that decision. I'm going to follow him.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. So there's a lot. I mean, and he's a smart man, right? So he knew the cost. Like he had some idea because I mean, Jesus didn't exactly have nice clothes. I mean, there was a lot of pressure all along. You know, not only was Jesus, you know, people listening to him and the crowds around him, but there was also already at this time the Pharisees who couldn't stand the man, right? So.
And there's so much trust, right?
Yeah.
Trusting that Jesus is the one, number one, but number two, that he's going to be okay, right? And Matthew, he records in chapter 5 and verse 28, it says, and he left everything behind and got up and began to follow him. So he forsook it all. His whole world being based on money, he stepped away from and absolutely unable to return. And so when Jesus says, follow me, at that moment, everything in his life that had meaning lost meaning. And he found a purpose that was greater than the money or anything that money could give him.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Fantastic. But that's not the end of the story. I mean, we could talk more about it, but there's more. So
Can we wrestle with this for just a
oh,
second?
yeah, absolutely.
As believers, as followers of Jesus, we say, okay, well, I've made that decision to follow him. Now what? You know, it's just great. You know, I'm following him. Perfect. This is a battle that is constant for anybody who's going to follow Jesus. I'm pretty sure that you don't just, you know, in my own personal experience, you don't just make that decision and you never struggle, right? You never deal with wrestling with these ideas. We're stuck with our own flesh. We have our own problems, things that lure us away from Jesus. And so Romans 12 was an important reminder to me as I was thinking through this process. Is that, therefore, I urge you, brethren, this is Romans 12, 1 and 2, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies a living and holy sacrifice, acceptable to God, which is your spiritual service of worship. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, so that you may prove or test what the will of God is, that which is good and acceptable and perfect. And so I'm just reminded that we are called to be living sacrifices, and that is a way of worshiping God. And that living sacrifice, the picture that's presented, it is so profound in my mind, because the sacrifices usually are dead, they're thrown on the altar, and they're done, right? But because we're living sacrifices, we have the ability and the potential of getting up off the altar and, you know, running away. And so I'm just in my own heart, that's one of the things that I think is important to recognize, that a moment by moment recognition that I have to submit to what God wants for me, that I have to follow him moment by moment, that I'm called to be a living sacrifice. So as a believer listening to this, wrestle with these things. And maybe the question is, okay, am I following him? Today, am I making that conscious decision, I'm going to do what he wants me to do? Or are you just going through life because that's what we do, right? Being intentional about it.
Yeah, Chris, what does it mean to be a believer? Like, what if we're not there? What if we find ourselves in the place where Levi found himself, where you just feel so isolated and alone? You see Jesus, and you want to follow him. Right. How do we get there? How do we bridge that divide?
Yeah. So to your point earlier, let me just point out nobody is too far gone for Jesus. Okay. And so when Jesus breaks into your life and he says, follow me, that's going to look different for different people, right? You might not be a tax collector sitting in a booth.
Right. Okay.
But you might be someone on the outside of society. You might be someone who's questioning things. You might be someone who doesn't know what to believe at this point. And so the beautiful thing about this is that the testimony that we have within Scripture is that Jesus is the Son of God, and that he has made a way for us to have that relationship with God. So apart from Jesus, there is no relationship with God. Why do we need a relationship with God? Well, first of all, we've been created for this relationship, but that relationship was broken when sin entered into the world. We all sin, and because we're sinners, we're separated from a holy, righteous, and perfect God. But He is loving to the extent that He would send His only begotten Son into the world to die on a cross, so that the punishment that we deserve would be put on His shoulders, and this beautiful exchange of my sin for His righteousness. Now, through faith in Jesus, I'm able to be acknowledged or recognized as righteous by God so that I can have this relationship with Him. And so this is what's happening. All the things that are behind the scenes in Matthew's heart at this moment, this is what we're seeing. Is this man who is coming to Jesus, recognizing who Jesus is, and following Him.
Mm-hmm. It sounds so simple in many ways, though. I mean, many religions require certain things of us,
Mhm.
right? Like if you do this, almost like a very like contractual sort of thing. What I'm seeing here with Matthew, and I'm assuming then that this is for every one of us, right? Is Jesus is pursuing Matthew. Matthew is fully aware of who Jesus is from the looks of things,
Mhm.
right? But there's no, Jesus didn't require anything of Matthew.
No.
The only requirement was his invitation to follow me.
Mhm.
And I feel like I see that, and I see that's exactly what's required of us.
Mhm.
God is calling us, we respond.
Right.
There is a human responsibility to respond to that call. But that call to follow Jesus is still there for all of us.
Mhm.
And we have a choice. We can choose. But there's not that, but that's it. There's that choice, and then you go on. There's not anything special. We don't have to make ourselves worthy. We don't have to do any sort of traditional sacrament or anything like that. It's just a simple belief, a simple trust in Jesus Christ.
Mhm.
Am I missing anything
No,
here,
you're
Chris?
exactly right, and that's
Okay.
what sets Jesus apart from everything else.
Mhm.
Right? In the following verses, all three of the Gospels put the very next thing as after this calling of Matthew. There's this confrontation, and then there's the disciples of John and the Pharisees. They're fasting, and they're the disciples of John are trying to figure things out. The Pharisees are saying, no, this is the way it needs to be. And they're still trying to hold people to actions. They're saying you have to do these things in order to be righteous. And Jesus, in the next few verses, he says, hang on, you don't mix these two things. You don't mix Jesus with following all of these instructions, these additional burdens that the Pharisees have put on people. And so there's a big difference between salvation in terms of what Jesus says is required for it, and in terms of what all other religions of the world say you have to do in order to get to heaven, or in order to be good enough to be with God, etc. And so there's no mixing of these things. And what's that question here is who Jesus is, right? If Jesus is the only begotten Son of God, and we believe He is, then that sacrifice on the cross was enough. That's what took care of the sins of mankind, right? And so that's what makes a way for us to be able to enjoy this relationship. It's not, well, that plus, yeah, he died, and it was good that he died, but it wasn't enough, right? And what you're basically saying when you add something to this gospel is that His sacrifice wasn't enough.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why Matthew, I think, and Mark, that's why Mark goes to such lengths to say, this is who Jesus is. And because He is this, you can trust Him, you can follow Him, and because you follow Him, it changes your life, and that changed Matthew's life.
Yeah, totally.
Changed Mark's life. Yeah,
Ch-
Matthew's
changes-
life,
yeah, all of them, all of them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it changes your life. It changes mine. I
Yeah.
know. So, friend, can I just let's personalize this a little bit, because we don't go to the Bible and just learn all of the head stuff. The Bible is a book that is inspired by the Holy Spirit, right? God Himself. And it's not meant for your entertainment, okay? It's meant to transform your life. Is it hitting a nerve? And if it is hitting a nerve, can I just say, awesome? That's awesome. But it does require a response from you. And friend, no matter what you're doing, like if you have a secret sin that you haven't showed anybody, you think nobody knows about it, well, guess what? Everything is laid bare before God, to whom you must give account. He knows it. but he's also made a way, he's already paid for it. But you need to go before the Lord. You do. You need to go before the Lord and respond to his follow me. What an amazing thing that is. Doesn't matter what it is, friend. It could be something that you're minimizing right now. The fact of the matter still remains that sin, what you're minimizing, that's treason against King God. It really is. It's a treasonous act, disobedience against an all-holy, righteous, perfect God. You can't stand. Who among us can stand against that? So today is that day where you just repent. Stop trying to hide it. Stop trying to fight against God. It's so exhausting. He says, come to me, I'll give you rest. He's already paid the penalty for it. Just respond to him. Don't rebel against him. But follow him today. Respond today.
Yeah. So we're in Mark chapter 2, verse 16. And so it's after this feast that that Matthew throws. He has this massive feast where he invites all his tax collector and sinner friends. So everyone that he's been associating with who's on the outside of the religious system, he invites them all over for dinner so that they can eat with Jesus, so that they can meet Jesus. And this is just an exceptional example of outreach, of just bringing people in, introducing our friends and coworkers to Jesus. But it's in this event, so it's like afterwards, the scribes and Pharisees go up to the disciples and they say, why is Jesus eating and drinking with tax collectors and sinners? So what's going on here, Chris? Who are these groups of people? Who are the scribes and Pharisees? And who are these sinners? And why is it such a big deal that Jesus is eating with them?
Mm-hmm. So, Grant, I appreciate that you point this out. So Levi, or Matthew, was so excited to follow Jesus that he invited others to meet with him, right? It's just this transformation that happens in his life. So all of the people he could invite, he invited the other tax collectors, and these were, thieves, thugs, hitmen, right? The sinners, right? And he invites these people, and it's the people that he knew. And so what had happened in that moment was that the gospel just broke into the tax collector community, it's incredible. And so it happens as he's reclining at the table in his house. So Jesus is there having a meal with these sinners. And this reclining at the table, usually this having a meal together was a sign of unity or acceptance, or it would show in some sense approval. And so now you have Jesus and the tax collectors and the sinners and the disciples all eating together. And that word sinners is a word that is used to describe those who had no respect for the Mosaic law or the rabbinical traditions. Okay, so that gives you the mindset of the Pharisees whenever they refer to these people as the sinners. It's because they're not following the rules, right? And so these people are enjoying this meal with Jesus, and Jesus has in some way affirmed them in having this meal. And so then, of course, the scribes and the Pharisees, they disapprove of Jesus' friends. The Pharisees were the most committed to the law and to the rabbinic traditions. And this was something that began kind of as a good thing. They're like, oh, the Bible's a good thing. We want to protect it, make sure that it's honored, and make sure it's not messed up, etc. But they took it too far, and so they began to add these different rules, and their focus was misguided, such that they started to see righteousness as following all of their rules versus following what God said. And so all of these extra things got added to it. And the scribes, they believed that salvation, even, this being made righteous, it came through segregation, right? And therefore, they themselves had no dealings with sinners. Ew, gross, don't touch me kind of thing, right? Mm-hmm. And so we see these outcasts, right? The paralytic, the man with leprosy, those who had demons, and now this one who is a tax collector. And they're like, no. And Jesus says, yes, come.
Mm-hmm. We do the exact same thing in our culture where we
No,
have
Grant, don't talk about that. That
No.
hurts a little bit.
yeah, but
How
let's
dare
talk
you.
about that. Where we have these church buildings and we all dress up really nice and we go and I've interacted with many people who tell me things like don't drink, don't smoke, don't chew, don't go with girls who don't have tattoos, don't have long hair, don't go to dances, don't listen to rock music. All these things that I've been told, and they're not really in the Bible, but these are rules that we have in place, and these are very religious things to do. And that's exactly what was going on. They had different rules, different things that they had set up with the Pharisees, but I mean, it's the same kind of thing where we don't, the religious don't really associate with those that they view as being sinful. We have this idea of setting ourselves apart. And so because we don't want to engage in the same activities, which is a good thing, we separate ourselves. And so we just have these two groups, and they're just sitting around judging each other. Those who are trying to be righteous and those who are trying to be sinful, and they judge each other for the judgmentalness that is being passed between the two. And here we see Jesus he's with both of these groups. He is he is eating with the Pharisees as well in other places. He goes to their dinner parties also, and then he goes and he's eating with the tax collectors and the sinners. And so we see Jesus is going to both of these groups. And so what do we do with that? When it comes to looking at our own lives, how are we reconciling all this in our brains? Like, how can we make sense of this?
I think the key is how we view righteousness. What is it that makes me righteous? And we have to be careful not to fall into the trap of thinking I'm righteous because I read my Bible, or I'm righteous because I go to church, or I'm righteous because I don't do any of the things that you mentioned, right? We have to have a righteousness that is found in Jesus Christ. And so that right away sets us apart. And so then the reason we do the things that we do, that might be reading our Bible and going to church and spending time with God's people, etc., right? Praying, all those good things. But those are a response, and as we act in community and we commune with God. So I think that it's good for us to think through, why do we do the things that we do? And it's good for us to examine, do I think that I'm more righteous because I do those things, or am I basing my righteousness on what Jesus has done for me, right? And that's what it comes down to.
I think something that's pretty glaring here is, again, the response of Matthew or Levi, right? And he's not reaching out to people who he doesn't like hang out in circles with. He reaches out to the people that he's always with, right? Like, I think this is just so stunning, right? Like he goes out and he's like, hey, friends, people that my acquaintances, whatever, you got to meet this guy, right? He's changed me. He's accepted me. He'd asked me to follow him. Who does that, right? And so he wants to share this excitement with all these other people. Again, these are tax collectors in his own house. These are sinners. And I find that first off, I love that. I love that about him because he's excited. And I think that we can take his example in that situation. And we don't have to necessarily go out and meet like complete strangers. When we have a home, we could call up our buddies and say, listen, you know what? I met Jesus and you need to meet him too. Let's talk about this. I think this is something that it's just so practical, right? This isn't like rocket science. Just go ahead and do it. But I think the other thing, the takeaway from this particular thing is the fact that the Pharisees are missing the point, because here they are saying, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? They never see their own depravity of their own hearts because they are so they have such delusions of grandeur. They have delusions of religiosity and look at how great I am, and never think for a second, wait a minute, if I stand before a holy God, I am just I have just as much worry about perishing in front of him as the people who don't even acknowledge God. And again, we go back to Grant, what you're saying. We have to understand rightly who we are before an holy God. And so I feel for these Pharisees and for these scribes, because they don't have a right view of themselves. And that's just the other thing that I'm taking away. And I have to ask myself too, like, what am I doing? Am I looking down my nose at somebody when in fact I should be looking in the mirror?
Yeah, I think the main difference between these two groups of people, the Pharisees, the religious, and the tax collectors, the sinners, is the tax collectors know they need Jesus. And the religious, the Pharisees, think that they're just fine without him, that Jesus can be a part of their world, but he isn't necessary. And the sinners are the unhealthy. They know they need a physician. They know they need a doctor, and there's nothing else for them apart from the doctor. And that I think, is crucial, because I think we can also read a passage like this and say, oh, Jesus is eating with the tax collectors and sinners, therefore everything's fine. There's no need for repentance. There's no need to get better, because everything is fine. You're accepted and loved, and you're right here, and this is where you always need to be, and there's nothing else beyond this. You are perfect right here.
You're accepted.
And there's something that happens here is Jesus calls Matthew, he calls Levi out of being a tax collector. He says, come follow me. He doesn't say, hey, let's be tax collectors together. Let's scoot over. Let's sit here and collect some taxes. He's calling him out of this. When you say the sick need a doctor, there is something that is being said here. That is, 1, you are sick. 2, you need a doctor. And 3, there is something beyond being sick. There's a purpose to having a doctor, and that is to be made healthy, to be made well. And we see this, and it's not that the Pharisees don't need a doctor, is that they don't see their need for a doctor.
And I think too, with that whole doctor thing, they're missing what Jesus is doing, right? They're missing, like, they think that he is accepting them. They're seeing that as that, but in fact, what he's doing, he's saying, no, they are made for so much more. They are created in the image of God. God has designed them certain ways, but most importantly, for a relationship with them. He's plucking them out of that sinfulness and showing them the love and mercy of God. And really, I just love Jesus's heart. When you have an encounter with Jesus, you are not the same. And that's the whole point. And it's just the Pharisees are missing this. And I think the other thing that I just think is so funny, the Pharisees are watching Jesus. They've seen him do miracles. They have heard his teaching at this point. So they're like, he's not fitting the mold, but they have a high standard for him. Like, if he's teaching this way and he's healing, then obviously he must be elevated to this standard. And he is just rocking the boat. He's turning things upside down. He's not like them, and that makes them furious.
Yeah, so this question they ask is a rebuke. And they rebuke him. Man, I wish I could have seen their faces right when Jesus comes back. And as I mentioned, we get these different perspectives from the different Gospels. In Matthew chapter 9 and verse 13, this is the response Jesus gives. He says, but go and learn. Now, this is a phrase by rabbis to rebuke, okay?
Oh, wow.
He says, but go and learn what this means. I desire compassion and not sacrifice. He's quoting from Hosea 6:6. So the Pharisees were so concerned with keeping the law outwardly, they neglected the inward or moral aspects of the law. And so Jesus just points to the problem. This is it. He calls it out right there. It's your heart. You need to get your heart right. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
he gives them homework. He's like, oh, you're coming to me with questions. Here, let me answer your questions. And it's kind of like an eavesdropping thing because they were going to the disciples and rebuking them. It's like, hey, I don't know if you're aware of this, but your rabbi is doing something wrong here. And then Jesus just walks in and he says, hey, here's some homework for you. Here's something to study up on. Go and educate yourself.
But do we see what's happening here is they are looking at God's word and they're saying this. And then Jesus uses his own word because Jesus is the word, right? And he says, well, what about this?
Yeah.
And boy, doesn't that sound very similar to what Satan did in the temptation in the desert when Satan's like quoting scripture to Jesus and Jesus is like, make all these things be bread. And he's like, man shall not live by bread alone. The whole thing it's just always this tension, right?
It's authoritative.
Yes.
The stone which the builders refused has become the chief cornerstone. Everything is built on Jesus. And the religious, they looked at Jesus and they judged him and found him wanting. They look at God himself and say, you are not good enough.
Yeah.
It's such a crazy place to be.
So this is the application, right? We shouldn't allow our pursuit of holiness to become a barrier that keeps us from other people. We shouldn't allow that pursuit. Following Jesus is not an insiders only club, right? The church is full of broken people who have experienced God's grace in such a way that their lives have been transformed. And this is really what separates Christianity from all the other religions, as I mentioned before. So we need God's grace, and we need what he says is righteous, right? Yeah.
So, friend, we went through a lot here, and when we think about it, we just went through 4 or 5 verses, which is great. But do you see how significant everything is? The authority of Jesus, that Jesus isn't around for. Jesus doesn't care about behavior modification. Okay, that's what's really happening with the Pharisees. He cares about the heart. Spoke to the heart of the tax collectors and sinners. He spoke to the heart of the Pharisees. I don't care. And Jesus doesn't care where you align yourself with. The fact is, both need Jesus Christ. So whatever camp you lie in, friend, you need Jesus. We all need Jesus. And if you're like, I want more teaching, of course you can listen to Q Radio, but I think one of the best things you could do is actually talk to people, like have a conversation, ask questions. Questions are so good.
Yeah.
If you have like a sincere question and you're like, okay, you just said this, but I don't quite understand it, you go to a Bible-believing church. Part of the reason why we have pastors come in is because we want you to understand that they are approachable people. They really love people. They love God's word, and they want you to understand the love that Jesus has for you. And so if you're in the Highland area, like the area, so or in Utah Valley for that matter, and you want to talk to Pastor Chris, I say go for it,
Yeah,
right? I
please
mean,
do.
you're so welcoming.
Oh,
You're
I
very
hope so.
approachable. Well,
yeah.
I mean, we hope that you're not feeling intimidated by this. These are good conversations to have, and you know that as much as Chris has opinions of his own, I'm sure, but you're looking at God's word. You say, well, let's see what God says about it, and that's why we really love having you here, is because we can ask these questions, and you say, all right, let's see what Jesus says.
Yeah.
That's really, he is the authority, and not Chris, and not any church, but Jesus himself. And through his word. And so if you are in the Highland area or Utah Valley in general, how would we connect with you?
Yeah, you can find us on Facebook or just through our website. You're able to email us through the website. That is lonepeak.church. And please, I love questions, right? I think that's one of the best ways that people learn is being able to ask their questions. And so it's a big part of our ministry, especially when we get into small groups. I like to ask a lot of questions, and I like people to ask questions. That's how we learn.
And I think that's a great way, that's good discourse, right? I think in today's society, we don't approach people and say, here's a question I have. Mostly we sit there and we just holler at each other. And so this might be a little new to many of us, especially if you're like me and I watch a lot of YouTube. But I think the fact of the matter is just be prepared for questions, but be prepared to be challenged as well. And it's okay not to have answers right away, and it's okay to feel a little uncomfortable. Because look what Jesus has done to these people. Just amazing.
Yep,
Just
very
amazing.
uncomfortable. Yep.
Thank you so much, Pastor Chris.
Thank you for having me.
Such a great conversation. Dear friend, thank you for joining us. Have yourself a fine weekend and dig into God's Word.